Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. No matter how well developed construction is in towns and cities, on the outskirts of any city, one can always find old, ready to fall apart barracks, short 1 or 2 stories high. They look out at the world with their crumbling windows, as if they were eye sockets. At first glance, it may seem that the tenants have long been gone, but only when you see the curtains in the windows, and sometimes even pots of flowers, it becomes clear the houses are still inhabited. Water is occasionally pumped into them, or it is even pumped manually. It is carried in jerrycans up into the rooms from a column in the yard. There are no toilets in the apartments. They are in the street, not far from the building itself. It was in one of these barracks on the outskirts of a small town that Leo was born and raised. He, of course, had an idea of modern large apartments with all the amenities. Having been on a couple of visits with his mother, he did not even want to leave it, but he could only dream of living in such beauty. When the family was full, there was such a chance. My father was on the waiting list for an apartment at the factory where he worked. Had he and his mother not divorced, Leo could have splashed and basked in a real bathtub, not the iron trough set in the corner of the kitchen. Some of the divorce was Leo's own fault, even though he was still a child at the time. His mother loved her son and thought he was kind but very vulnerable. She was ready for anything from the day Leo was born. As long as he didn't throw tantrums, the boy was skillfully manipulative, and at every opportunity he had tears in his eyes on and off, and his whole appearance spoke of the coming tantrums. At such moments he had known from childhood that his mother would fulfill any whim so that her son would not suffer. His father, on the contrary, was moderately strict and stern with his son, but he worked very hard and often came in after midnight. One day, when Leo was already in the 6th grade, he got a serious beating from his father. That morning was not a good day for the boy. First, he got a bad grade in literature, but it was not the first time, and he knew for sure that his mother would find out and say, "Well, son, don't get upset. It was no big deal. It was just a grade. You'll learn, you'll pass." And if his classmates were afraid to go home with a bad grade in their diary, Leo was even glad. After all, his mother was afraid he would get upset. On the contrary, in such a case, she tried to please her son with something. Usually, it was an ice cream or chocolate bar. Then, on the same day, he got into a fight in the school corridor. He was a year older, but very thin and clumsy. Leo would call him names or trip him up every chance he got. He usually walked away silently, but this time he pushed him back. A scuffle broke out. The teacher who arrived did not even doubt who the instigator was and dragged Leo to the principal's office. Of course, his mother was called and the school was summoned, but it wasn't the first time either. And he knew exactly what the parent would say. "Well, what do you want? They're boys." And my Leo sure as hell couldn't have started first. He's a quiet, easygoing guy. How she was so sure of her son's innocence that no argument from the principal could change her mind. The last straw in the chain of incidents of the day was a visit from a neighbor in the barracks. Father, as if on purpose, was earlier than usual at home, and opening the door, he heard, "I've had enough of this outrage. If you do not stop your brat, we, all the neighbors, will report him to the police. If you can't bring him up, the brat will be brought up in a juvenile hall." The father tried to stop him, asked for forgiveness, but the neighbor was very angry and continued. First he scratched the neighbor's door at the end of the hallway. Then he set fire to the outdoor toilet. Barely put it out. Now he tried to tear off my car mirror, and he almost succeeded. And if I hadn't looked out the window I wouldn't even know who did it. What followed was the father's apology, a promise to whip his son, and a promise to buy and install a mirror the very next day. As soon as the door closed behind the neighbor, the father silently pulled out his belt. No matter how hard his mother tried to justify and defend her son, this time his son got a good beating. His father flogged him so hard it hurt him to sit in school in the morning. But that was the first and the last time. That evening my parents argued very loudly and for a long time. My father yelled, "You brought up a completely uncontrollable thug with your care and custody. Now we're reaping the rewards. He's just a kid. In a couple of years, at this rate, he will easily end up in a juvenile prison. He doesn't listen to anyone, not his teachers, not his parents. He should be flogged and flogged and flogged. I'll take control of it now." The mother cried back and said that she couldn't leave her son with such a tyrant father for even a second now, and she wasn't going to live with him anymore. Leo didn't think it would take such a serious turn. His parents had been fighting over him a lot lately, but then it was business as usual. This time his mother insisted on divorcing him right away, after which his father left, and Leo never saw him again. Mother was adamantly against their communication. And as he found out later, years later, he even sent back child support. One could not say that Leo was upset. On the contrary, he took full advantage of his mother's love and kindness. Now no one could stop him from demanding anything he wanted. His mother worked 3 jobs to make sure her son did not need anything. With difficulty, he graduated from high school and had no intention of further study or work. His mother did not bother him with these questions and continued to work long days off to provide for her son's poverty-stricken existence. Every time we met, the roommate next door would say, "Get your big man to work. How long is he going to sit on your neck?" But she just waved it off. "What are you talking about? Let him take another walk. You'll still have time to go to work." It was as if she did not realize that she had brought up an arrogant bum and selfish man who lived at her expense. One day, one winter month, she came home barely alive. The woman had a fever of nearly 40, but all she could think about was that her son should not worry. She took her pills and lay down quietly. The only thing her son asked that night was, "Mother, what to eat?" The woman said in a quiet voice. "Son, I don't feel well. There, in the fridge, yesterday's cutlets. Eat. I'll cook them tomorrow morning." He did not even wonder why his mother, who was always working in the kitchen, did not get up, went and started making noise with the dishes in the kitchen. Helen thought she just had a cold. At one of her jobs in the evenings, she washed entryways, high-rises not far from their barracks. She had to carry heavy buckets and pour ice, cold water over the floors. The woman decided that this was the cause of her heavy cough and fever. She could not allow herself to be sick for long. She had to live on something. After lying down for a day and taking the fever down with aspirin, she went to earn money for her son's caprices again. With time, the cough did not go away. It only got stronger and stronger. When after a while, the same neighbor saw how emaciated she was and heard her cough, she literally dragged her to the doctor by force. After all the tests and examinations, a verdict was pronounced. The woman had respiratory tract cancer, and the stage was no longer operable. Leo's mother passed away very quickly, literally burning up like a match. But even when she fell ill, Leo didn't think twice about getting a job. The mother, when she felt that she was dying, said that the father set up an account for his son and regularly transferred alimony there. The father himself died when Leo had already graduated from high school. The woman never touched the money. On the contrary, she added at least a penny to the account whenever possible. That's how Leo started to live on it. Lena's funeral was organized by neighbors. My son, sitting at the funeral, kept whispering, "You had no right to do this to me. You abandoned me. How am I going to live now? How am I going to live now? What am I going to eat and drink on?" It seemed that at this moment he was saddened, not by the loss of his mother, but by the end of his carefree life. Now he had to think for himself how to do the laundry the cleaning, and, most importantly, how to live. Money had a way of running out here, and the small savings began to come to an end. Leo began to think more and more about finding a job, though he had no idea what kind and how to look for it. Having bought a local newspaper where vacancies were printed on the last page, he was about to look for something suitable, but his gaze was caught by an article on the first page titled, Leo quickly read it and thought about it. The article talked about a new kind of scam that had appeared in their area. Some smart guy was looking for wealthy single women and managed to convince them that he was insanely rich, posing as a sheik. He said that in his homeland he possessed countless riches. He went on to colorfully describe his castles filled with gold and diamonds, garages with expensive limousines, and even yachts. Having gained the ladies' trust with his compliments and advances, they were told the stories in which the newfound sheik was caught. A timid request for help was followed by a promise to compensate everything and even to marry in the future. None of the women could resist the sheik's charm and gentle words, and they gave all they could. After reading the article, Leo thought about it for some time, and in his mind was born a brilliant, in his opinion, plan. All the next night he sat at the computer, which his mother had given him as a graduation present. He registered on several dating sites at once and wrote his fictitious biography of a former officer everywhere. Leo described non-existent garrisons, as he always liked to watch movies about army and war. As if unintentionally, he wrote that he was the best officer in a hot spot until he was wounded. Further, all the letters to potential brides described how the army had mistreated him and literally left him without a livelihood. He came up with a story that touched the soul of any trusting woman. How his former commander had a grudge against him for reproaching him for stealing. According to him, immediately after Leo left the hospital, his former commander framed him. After that, the supposedly brave officer was kicked out of the army indiscriminately and with a pension. It was difficult to find a normal job, but he was ready to brighten up life and help with everyday matters to anyone. But with domestic matters was, of course, embellished. After all, he didn't even know how to hammer nails, let alone anything more global. Leo hoped that a large number of rich ladies would respond to such a life story, and he would still choose who to stay with. But only Anne, who turned out to have been a widow for more than 2 years and lived in a distant but very big city, responded. A week later, Leo already knew that the woman was living with her adult daughter in the large house that had been left behind by her husband's death. The trusting lady soon revealed that she also had 2 cars and a decent amount of money in her accounts. Only from her words, it did not bring happiness. Leo immediately ignited fiery feelings and began to shower her with compliments and affectionate words. In a couple of weeks, the woman wrote to thank him for bringing her back to life and invited him to come see her. The virtual romance gained momentum, and soon Leo passionately, fervently declared his love for Anne. Wrote that he would like to be around forever and ready to get married. Only, he said, there was a little difficulty. Ready to rush to you tomorrow on wings, he said. The groom wrote and continued, only my financial situation has temporarily deteriorated, and I will have to postpone the meeting indefinitely. But the woman was already ready for anything, just to be near her beloved. And not only was she very trusting, but by that time she was already madly in love with her new groom. Anne transferred money to him on the same day for the journey and said that she was waiting for him very much. Leo set off with ease and without remorse for what he thought would be a happy life. Anne met him right at the train station in a cab. In half an hour, they were at Leo's future property. That, at least, was what he already thought in full confidence, that he would be left here. The house seemed like a whole castle after his barracks. It was nothing compared to the small apartments of relatives he'd once visited. A huge 2-story house, as it seemed to the new groom, could accommodate all the inhabitants of his barracks on the outskirts. The house was clean, stylish, and all the rooms were light from ceiling to floor. It made the house seem even bigger on the inside. He didn't hesitate to walk through the rooms and look at everything, like in a museum. She was expecting him very much, laid a beautiful candlelit table. Her daughter was staying with a friend that day, and no one could stop them. They sat around the fireplace all night, and Anne, at Leo's request, talked about herself. He might not have been that interested, but it was necessary to pretend that the lover wanted to know as much as possible about her. And what topics could he talk to her about? Ignoramus. Also, all he had to do was keep quiet and listen, which suited him just fine. As a child, unlike her newfound fiancé, Anne had lived in affluence, one might even say in luxury. Her father was always in executive positions in the city administration, and her mother was a director in one of the largest restaurants. Anne was always a quiet and obedient child and caused only joy to her parents. From childhood, she was in love with gymnastics and enjoyed music and dancing. But by high school, there remained only a passion for sports. She participated in almost every gymnastics competition and placed first. The whole wall in her room was covered with medals and diplomas. There was no question for the girl to choose the institute. And after graduation, Anne took up coaching. She hadn't competed for several years, but now she took her apprentices to all the competitions. At one of these tournaments, she met her future husband, George. She immediately noticed a tall, slender blond man sitting next to the judges. "Car sponsor," Helen whispered quietly, "the coach of the junior national team." She noticed Anne keeping her eyes on the handsome man and continued, "He's the owner of a very large construction company. He's single, by the way. I think he'll be at the banquet after the competition, and you should meet him. You should meet him." And as if nothing had happened, continued to follow the performance of the wards. In the evening, a grand banquet was held at the hotel restaurant. What was Anne's surprise when George himself came up to her holding out a glass of champagne and said, "Ariana, permission to court you. My name is George. I am a long-time admirer of yours. I've always enjoyed watching you perform, and now your pupils." That evening, he did not leave Anya's side. They conversed on many subjects and danced a great deal. George turned out to be a gallant gentleman and moved beautifully. While dancing, Anne felt the strong and steady hands of her partner and caught herself at the thought that she wished that exactly the man was always there. At that moment, she could not even think that in a couple of weeks he would propose to her. In another year, they would have a beautiful daughter. They hadn't decided on a name beforehand. Or rather, it was her husband's idea. He said, "Our daughter should only be Maria. After all, she's sure to follow in your footsteps, and in sports you only need to win." My daughter really began to show great promise from her first lessons, and afterwards she came back from all the competitions with only medals. Her mother coached her, of course, and was very proud of her. Her father adored his daughter, and if possible, always went with them to competitions to support them. When Maria turned 18, she heard about an international tournament that was to be held in a southern city. Those who had won first place in past competitions were sent there, then took second place, so she was not included in the list of participants. But she begged tearfully, "Mommy, I know you can do anything. Please help me get there. I really want to go, and I know for a fact that this time I'm going to win. I really need to go there." The girl looked at her mother with such hope and entreaty that she promised to try to help. The next day, it turned out that a spot had become available. One of the participants had been hospitalized and a replacement was needed. Anne talked to the management, and no one was against Maria going there. On a family council, it was decided to go as a family, and Anne's parents were to go too. They had not vacationed for a long time. Here was a suggestion. If first we'll breathe the mountain air and after victory, and she is sure to win, we'll go to the sea. It's close by. If she had only known then what this trip would bring them, she would have done anything to stay home. They settled down in a beautiful place. There were little cottages right at the foot of the mountain. The air was really the cleanest. And it had been decided that while the girls would be training in the city, George and his parents would stay at the base in the mountains. And then the whole family would come to the competition. But it was not destined to happen. During training, there was an earthquake. The locals reassured them that it happens often, and the tremors are not so strong. Waited out for a while. They continued to practice, but an organizer who ran into the gym interrupted the practice, and in a panic began shouting confusedly. Oh, there was an earthquake in the mountains. A landslide hit a cottage community. Rescuers are already working there. Let's go quickly. They need to know how many people were left there. Ala could not remember how they ended up at the bottom, and was ready to dig through the rubble with her bare hands, just to find her loved ones. But, of course, no one was allowed near there, and the rescuers continued their search. All night Anne and her daughter were awake, waiting for news. In the morning they got the terrible news. 6 bodies were found. Among them were Anne and George's parents. The woman's screams were heard from 1,000 kilometers away. Anne cried without stopping, and at that moment, as she was telling it all, she, after a little silence, said quietly, "It was all my fault, and if I hadn't arranged the competition, they would be alive." Leo took her hand in his and, stroking it, muttered, "Come on, Anne. It's life itself that decides everything and puts everything in its place. You have nothing to do with it. Don't kill yourself like that. Time heals, all will pass." What happened next? How did you, poor thing, get through it all? Anne wiped away her tears and, looking at the fire in the fireplace, continued to tell how at the moment when she learned of the death of her relatives, the world for her had literally collapsed. If it were not for her daughter, she was ready to lay hands on herself. The woman became grey as a shadow, and mourning for her ended not in a year or two. Everything going on around her became uninteresting. Even her favorite work she abandoned, and the victories of her daughter did not bring the same joy. No matter how Maria did not try to distract her by buying tickets to the theater and vacations, the woman was against everything. She wanted to crawl into a corner and cry without stopping. Neither doctors nor prescribed sedatives helped. One day, my daughter couldn't take it anymore and said, "One day, my daughter couldn't take it anymore and stop killing yourself." There's no getting them back. It's been 2 years. It's scary to look at you. You don't go anywhere. At least talk to me on the internet. Maria brought a laptop to her mother's room, registered her mother in several social networks and on a dating site. She didn't really believe in all this internet dating, but still, she hoped that at least this way Mom would be distracted and find friends. Imagine her daughter's surprise when after a couple of weeks her mother seemed to come to life, and after a couple of weeks she was unrecognizable. The woman's eyes shone like those of a schoolgirl in love. The woman turned to Leo and spoke softly. "Meeting you made me want to live, communicate love for the first time in 2 years. Thank you. Thank you." From that day on, Leo settled into Anne's house and lived like heaven. They were married almost immediately, and the woman never thought for a second that she knew almost nothing about him. Anne was in love, and she didn't care about anything else. The woman was willing to do anything just to be with him all her life. Leo sat all day in front of the television or at the computer, and when Anne went to work, from which she was happy to return, he languidly said, "I need some money. Maybe I'll go and look for a job." The woman gave him a decent sum, and then he did not have to ask for anything. Anne started leaving him money regularly, saying, "I left some. Don't feel bad that you can't find a job. My savings are enough for us. Go out, go somewhere." Leo couldn't be happy with his life. It was just like before under his mother. Someone worried, so he wouldn't get upset and was willing to support him. The money he received from Anne he usually left for bars or spent on himself. He had already bought an expensive phone, a watch, and was going to buy a laptop computer. Later, he hoped to pass his driver's license and ask his wife for one of the expensive cars in the garage. What's more, he was sure she would gladly give him the keys. Maria was surprised at her mother's choice. They were very different. The refined, cultured Anne and the brash, somewhat swaggering, chosen one Maria did not like from the first day. Leo did not like from the first day. Leo did not look like a retired officer. At times it seemed that not only did he have no higher education, but it was unknown whether or not he had graduated from school. He didn't even seem to have anything to talk about. This surprised the girl even more. What her well-read mother could communicate about with this bumpkin was incomprehensible. But the main thing, Maria thought, was for her mother to be happy, and for her to look as happy as she did with her father. Everything would have gone on like that if one day, when Anne wasn't home, that brat hadn't tried to molest Maria. He came up to her in the kitchen and wanted to kiss her. The girl didn't take long to punch him in the face, just as her father had once taught her to defend herself. Leo bent down and howled. Leo bent down and howled. "It hurts." With this phrase of his, Anne suddenly returned. Maria immediately ran up to her crying, began to complain. "Mom, this scoundrel tried to molest me. He came into the kitchen where I was having breakfast and started groping me with his sweaty hands." But then the hubby who had recovered from his stroke spoke up. "Don't listen to her, honey. And what did you think you were, you little fool? I came into the kitchen to make some tea, and she started saying that I was not a match for you, and that she wouldn't let us live together. I just wanted to push her aside to go to the stove, and took her by the shoulder, and there it was, hitting me like a tree." To Maria's surprise, the mother believed this Alphonse, not her own daughter, and asked her to stay out of their lives. Said they loved each other and would be together whether she wanted them to or not. From that day on, there was no longer any of the good relations in the house. Maria tried to have less contact with Leo, and communication with mother was reduced to a minimum. The girl decided by all means to find out as much as she could about this dependent spawner from here. On one of the days, Maria managed, while Leo went to skip out on Anne's money once again, to look into his passport, writing down his address of residence. She went to the town where this beau had come from. He once told her mother that he had a huge apartment back home, but it had very expensive repairs and furniture, so he didn't want to rent it out. He added then that there was a beautiful neighbor who still had her keys, and she looked after his place. It wasn't a short drive, almost 2 days. But Maria really hoped it wasn't for nothing. Arriving in a small town, she could hardly find a shabby hotel, which seemed not to have been updated since its opening, and it was 20 years ago. But she had nothing to choose from, and she didn't know how long she would stay. I did not want to live at the railway station. Maria could not believe that it was this dilapidated hovel with a toilet in the street that she needed. No luxury apartment in this slum was out of the question. Trying to find the very same neighbor, she was beginning to think that she too is imaginary. But one of the neighbors said that she lived next door, but had gone to visit her sister for a couple of days. No one knew her sister's address, of course, and Maria had to spend almost 3 days in a terrible hotel. When the neighbor showed up, Maria also said hello from Leo and introduced herself as his stepdaughter. She lied that she was in town on a business trip and that her stepfather had asked her to pick up some things in the apartment. The woman silently gave her the keys, not even asking too many questions. Upon entering this abandoned and rather dirty lair of an Alphonse, Maria began to look around squeamishly. All the furniture in the small room was rather old and covered with a thick layer of dust. There was a wobbly table and one stool in the kitchen where it seemed that no more than 2 people would fit. A second stool lay to the side with its leg torn off. Apparently, the owner did not have time to fix it, or did not even know how. The 2-burner stove and the small refrigerator never seemed to have seen a rag or detergent. The girl was disgusted to be here, but the goal was important to her. Anne went back to her room. to the old computer, which she noticed as soon as she walked in there. And, luckily for her, the catcher didn't even try to set a password, and it's understandable why. Maria was shocked at how many dating sites he was registered on, and how many women he tried to fool the head with a story about his alleged military past, orders and medals and promiscuous wife. She downloaded and copied everything she could onto a flash drive, hoping to open her mother's eyes. Maria was about to leave when a thick notebook on the table next to the keyboard caught her attention. Wiping the dust off it, she opened it and began to read quickly. It turned out to be Leo's diary. His handwriting wasn't perfect, and the errors were so numerous that there was no doubt of his education. The notebook described in detail the life of this swindler. There were childish resentments against his mother, who gave him little money, dreams of a rich life without poverty, and angry words to his father, who tried to bring him up. There was also a description of the day when he came across an article about swindlers, Sultanov, and details of his brilliant plan with a biography of a former officer. The girl almost cried from resentment when she read how he wrote about acquaintance with her mother. Finally, a fool has been found, ready to put me on her neck. Gray, unsightly, but her husband left a lot of money. The last entry was, fell in love like a cat. Target's almost there. Today, the money for the tickets to the happy life is coming. The fool sent out so much that there's still enough left over to dress up nicely. Goodbye, slums. When I get my registration in the Newcastle, I'll sell this shack to the devil. Maria could not believe it, but her mother was brazenly used. It was urgent to stop this farce before he and I didn't have time to check it in, though. After taking the diary, she hurried back home. During this time, many new things happened in Anne's house. The same day that Maria disappeared, leaving a note, the doorbell rang early in the morning. When she saw the caller, Anne shouted joyfully, "Sis, they let you out. How glad I am. Come in quickly. Make yourself comfortable." On the doorstep was her own sister, whom she had supported in prison for years by sending money, as she tried to make it up to her somehow, though she never fully understood what it was. Kate was 5 years younger than Anne. The girls had been very different since childhood. Anne had always been an obedient and intelligent child, while Kate was capricious. From the very birth, she demanded from her parents to pay as much attention to her as possible, but everything turned out the opposite. For every prank, she was punished and deprived of some tasty treats or gifts, and her sister received only praise. Kate was angry and seemed to hate her sister, but the latter, on the contrary, tried to take pity on her and secretly shared sweets and presents, but it did not change her sister's attitude, as if it made her even angrier. The years went by. After school, Anne went straight to college and graduated with honors, and Kate, having fallen in love with a local rocker, began to disappear with him to clubs, coming home sometimes in the morning. The parents were shocked by such a beau and thought it was a disgrace to their famous family in the city. One day, waiting for Kate to wake up in the morning, the father made a whole scandal. He yelled indignantly, "Do you have any idea who you're messing with? No money, no normal job. All he can do is play in pubs. We didn't raise our daughters to hang out in bars with such lazy bums. If anybody found out, my mother and I would be ashamed to look people in the eye. It won't do you any good to talk to him. If you don't stop these meetings, I'll stop giving you money, and I'll deprive you of your share of the inheritance in general." Kate responded by throwing a whole tantrum, smashing a vase that her mother loved very much. She scratched the dresser by throwing a chair at it. She started screaming back, "You've always disliked me, and now you want to ruin my life. If your sweetheart had fallen in love with him, you would have accepted him into the family without a word. But I can't do anything in this house. I won't die without your money. You can keep it all. Let him choke on it." Her father couldn't stand it and threw her out the door, shouting after her that he didn't want her in this house anymore. Anne heard everything at the door, and when her father threw her sister out, she rushed after her. When she caught up, she cried and begged her not to leave. She said her father would step back and everything would be as it was. But her sister hissed angrily, "I hate you. I'm sick of watching them mess with you. I'll give you a heavenly life yet. You'll be sorry you were ever born into this world." Finally, she pushed Anne as hard as she could, and she couldn't hold on, so she fell in a puddle. Accused her of all her grave sins and demanded not to disturb her anymore. There was so much hatred for her sister in Kate's eyes that she did not try her fate a second time and quietly left. But all the time, as much as she could, she tried to find out how her sister lived and what she was doing. Years later, after her parents died, the girl showed up. She somehow managed to find Anne and ask for help. It turned out that she had helped her roommate sell his stolen goods and ended up behind bars. In a letter she wrote that the rocker had immediately turned his back on her and very quickly married some girl. All the time that followed, Anne sent considerable sums to her sister in prison, and now she showed up on her doorstep. Anne offered to live together. They say the place is plenty, enough for everyone. She really wanted the family to be big and friendly and her relationship with her sister to change. But seeing no joy on Kate's face, she said quietly, "Well, then live until we can find you something and buy you your own place." By that time, my parents' apartment was already sold, and Kate had nowhere else to go but to her sister, and she wanted to carry out the plan she had thought of a long time ago. She seemed to grudgingly agree, and they put her in a separate big room. Maria, who returned home, had no idea that an aunt, unknown to her personally, but known from her mother's stories, had settled in one of the rooms. Maria made her way to the living room, where her stepfather liked to sit in front of the television with a beer. Right from the threshold, she began, "Well, relaxing. And I've been to your so-called apartment, a squalid hovel of poverty, a toilet in the street. That's where you lived, and where you should live. I found a lot of interesting things there. You weren't the only one who was bullshitting my mother. I took your diary with me." Seeing Leo tense, she continued, "I hid it safely. You won't find it, that's for sure." Maria deliberately left out the fact that she had hidden it somewhere else and hadn't even brought it home. Leo jumped up from the couch and tried to grab the girl to find out where she had hidden the cherished notebook. But Maria managed to dodge and run away. She stayed with her friend, to whom she took the diary until the evening. The girl did not want to go home without her mother. She did not like the company of this impudent lover, and she did not like the company of this impudent lover, and she did not know what could be expected of him. She was not afraid of it for nothing. Leo had thought of nothing else but to get a bottle of whiskey from the bar and literally in half an hour get drunk to the point of insanity. He fell asleep with the glass in his hands on the living room couch. When Kate came out of her room and saw an insane Leo, she decided that the hour of reckoning with her sister had arrived. Very quickly, she managed to undress this boogeyman, and after stripping herself, she lay down beside him. Just as she took a few pictures with her sister's gifted phone in her arms with him, the door opened and Anne walked in. The pictures were no longer needed. She saw it all for herself in literally a second. The woman stood on the threshold and all she could utter was, "How come? Leo, Kate, how could you?" and cried and jumped out of the house, not knowing what to do or where to run. She had lost her loved ones again. Only this time they didn't die, they just betrayed her. Through the tears and downpour, she ran without feeling the ground beneath her feet, seeing nothing in front of her. Leo, waking up from the screaming, even though he was drunk, immediately assessed the situation. With trembling hands, he began to put on his pants and shouted, "You beast! What have you done? You beast! What have you done? You've broken what I've been building for a long time." But the sister only smiled victoriously and calmly replied, "But I got my revenge for everything, even though it wasn't so easy. How fat and nasty you are. Even after so many years in prison, I didn't like touching you. Leo jumped up to her with some kind of crazy scream and punched her in the face with all his might. The blow was such that the woman lost consciousness, but without even checking to see if she was alive or not, the man thought he had killed her. The first thing that came into his mind was arson. So he decided to get rid of the corpse, and as soon as the fire broke out, he quickly walked away. Maria, after sitting at her friend's house, knowing that her mother was always back by this time, went home. The first thing she saw was a blaze, like a fire right on the side of their house. The girl immediately ran, afraid to even think that it was the house on fire. The fire had not yet had time to engulf all the structures, and as she peered through the first floor window, she saw a woman's silhouette lying on the floor. Mummy, be patient. I'll be right there," screamed Mariah, and opening the front door began to make her way into the living room where the woman lay. Either the influx was the culprit. The fire was burning with lightning speed, but it was not the oxygen or the abundance of carpets on the floors. In a couple of seconds it was impossible to breathe, and the girl did not even realize how she lost consciousness. She woke up in total darkness, feeling someone nearby. She asked, "Who is there? Why can't I see anything?" The invisible woman stroked her hand and said softly, "Calm down. It's all right now. Don't you remember? Your house burned down, and the firemen pulled you out of the fire almost in the last minutes before the slabs collapsed." The girl instinctively reached out her hands to her face, but the woman stopped her. "Hendon, don't touch, please. You have numerous burns, including on your face. But the doctor said that it is possible to have plastic surgery in time, and you will be as before and perhaps even more beautiful." At that moment, the girl heard pity in her voice and realized that she was saying this, most likely to reassure her. Maria remembered that she had rushed into the house to save her mother, but she had not had time to do so. Now she was left all alone on the planet, also with a mangled face. At that moment, it seemed to her that there was nothing else to live for, and it would be better for her to die there on the fire. But life once again prepared surprises. The first, and not very pleasant for the girl, was Leo's visit to her stepdaughter in the hospital. He went almost every day, reassuring her that everything would be okay. When the girl asked, "Where were you? And why was Mom lying on the floor when the fire happened?" Well, he literally froze, and in a second he was already clinging to the thought. After all, it was true that if the daughter thought Mom was there on the floor, he was suddenly a widower and could claim all the property. The house, of course, was half burned down, but it was possible to find buyers even for such a structure. And then there was the land with the foreign cars and the bank account. He sat by the girl's bedside and was already mentally counting the riches, his self-serving mind devising a plan to become the owner of everything, leaving his stepdaughter out of the picture. Since only Leo could identify the burnt body at that moment, he, wiping away a tear, confirmed that it was his wife, which he informed his stepdaughter. After waiting the due date, he inherited and already rubbed his hands, but it was necessary somehow to get rid of another heiress. And he did not, of course, intend to kill her. He had big plans for his life now, and he was a coward. Kate appeared to him in terrible dreams almost every day, so he persuaded Maria to live in the countryside and supposedly improve her health, bought a small abandoned house, and took the girl there. Maria didn't even resist. Who needed her now in this city with an ugly face and body? She sat in the dark hut for the first day, staring out the window. Maria did not understand and did not know how to go on living. But in the morning, when she saw the gentle rays of the sun through the window and heard the birds sing, she decided that life, even if not the same as before, but it goes on. All day long she put everything in order, washing, laundering, and cleaning. By evening, the house was unrecognizable. It literally shone with cleanliness. But in the evening, sitting on the porch, she was ready to burst into tears. Maria realized that no matter how much she distracted herself, the feeling of loneliness and the ugly face would not go away. In the morning, she was awakened by a soft knock on the window. When she looked out the window, she saw a short, gray-haired old man wrapped in a blanket. Maria stepped out onto the porch. "Oh, good morning, neighbor," the old man began. And he was the first person who wasn't startled by her face. "The old lady here gave you some milk and pies. Told me to treat my neighbor. My grandfather's name is Thomas, by the way. And my grandmother, if you will, is Elizabeth. Don't be shy. Come and see us." Maria hesitated for a couple of days to take the milk jug and the plate. But then I thought I should say thank you and went to the neighbors. While they were drinking tea and cake, Maria told them about herself. The old men, of course, did not ask, but it was obvious that they wondered where this poor woman with an ugly face had come from in this backwood. From that day on, they became friends. Maria now, almost every day, she hurried to help the old people in any way she could. Sometimes she did something together with them in the garden, which they had taught her to do, and sometimes she swept and helped them. One morning she saw an expensive foreign car parked in front of their house. Frightened for them, she quickly got dressed and rushed there. What was her surprise when a joyful grandmother was setting the table, and the grandfather, hugging the girl about 7 years old, muttered, "Oh, you are my clever girl, my beauty. Finally, we have waited for you to visit. We'd forgotten all about Grandpa and Grandma." When she saw Maria, Grandma said happily, "Here, the neighbor's son finally brought us a granddaughter. Come on in. We'll have tea and pancakes." At that moment, a man in an expensive suit entered the house and saw the girl. As if nothing had happened, said, "Hello. And you must be the famous neighbor. My parents talked my ear off on the phone. I even know that your name is Maria, and I am Max." He held out his hand to her, and his handshake made her feel warm and exciting. Then they all drank tea together. Maria found out that Max was a very famous banker in the city, and many times he offered to move his parents to the city, even to his own place. But they said that they would never leave the village where they were born and lived all their lives. The daughter at first was frightened to see Maria's face, and it was clear that the girl was afraid to look at her face. But in an hour they easily communicated with each other, and as the man was leaving, Maria suggested, "Would you like me to do gymnastics with the girl while she's like me to do gymnastics with the girl while she's here with her grandparent?" By this time, the banker already knew about the girl's athletic background, and he immediately agreed, which made his daughter happy. From that day on, Maria came to the neighbor's house every day and practiced with the girl. Surprisingly, she caught everything on the fly, and she really enjoyed it. A month flew by without a moment's notice. Maria often thought of Max during that time. She was sorry that now, with such a face, she could not even dream of ever being with such a man by her side and having a happy family. But the girl could not command her heart not to flinch. When once again she saw Max's car outside the neighbor's house, she could hardly restrain herself from rushing to the neighbors at the same moment, but she decided to give her parents and daughter a chance to talk, and in the meantime she made a quiche so that she would not come in empty-handed. She couldn't even imagine what was going on at the neighbor's house at this time. Max decided to bring his gardener to help his parents. It was fruit and vegetable season, and the garden and beds needed care. And it was already difficult for the old people to keep up with everything. The banker suggested that the gardener go to the village and added, "I know you are not alone now. Your companion after the hospital with memory loss. He will help your parents. And she will breathe the country air rest on the river. Maybe her memories will start coming back, too." They agreed, of course. And as soon as they arrived in the village, a joyful girl ran out of the house and rushed to her father, screaming, "Daddy, I'm so glad you came." Hugging her father, she continued, "I study with Maria every day. She says, I have talent and can be a real athlete. Look what I can do now. As if to prove it, the girl did some cartwheels right on the grass. When Anne saw these, yet clumsy elements of gymnastics, she was literally shocked. Her performances, the medals on the wall, and her huge house, her daughter, all at once began to come to mind. The woman remembered everything at once. Seeing her turn pale, they barely had time to pick her up under her arms. The old men were frightened and flailing about. The grandmother ran for heart drops and water, and the grandfather immediately dragged a stool, and the grandfather immediately dragged a stool, and they sat her down. Anne sat bewildered for a while longer, then looked up and said quietly, I remember everything. I used to do gymnastics, and now I coach kids. I have a daughter, Maria. She too, athlete, she frightenedly continued. I don't know where she is. She needs to be found. How did I end up here? The man fell to his knees and, taking Anne by the hands, told her everything. He lived in a small house alone. He had never had a family. Since childhood, he had shunned people because of his disability. One leg was a few inches shorter than the other, and he had a noticeable limp. Alex had already lost hope of meeting love and starting a family when he found Anne unconscious, with only a small purse slung over her neck, which contained her driver's license, and from it he could only learn the age and name of the unfortunate woman. Putting the documents in his backpack, he immediately called the doctors and went with her to the hospital. As soon as the woman regained consciousness, the man realized that she remembered nothing of her past life. He decided that this was fate, and he had to use it. After she calmed down, she remembered how, when she saw her husband and his sister in bed, she jumped out into the street and decided that there was no point in her living, having lost the people dear to her heart for the second time in her life. It seemed to her that she would not survive it. She ran to the cliff, and for a long time she couldn't dare to jump, but at a certain moment her leg moved and she didn't remember anything else. She woke up in the hospital, and there was a man in his 50s sitting by the bed. It turned out to be Alex, who introduced himself as her lover. He began to tell her how happy they had been before her fall, how he had taken care of her and told her that he had always loved her and that he loved her only. After Anne was discharged from the hospital, he brought her to his little house and began to take care of her. He did everything so sincerely that she didn't even doubt that it was true. With tears and fear that he would drive her away, he looked at Anne and continued, Well, forgive me, just do not leave me a fool. I cannot live without you now. I love you with all my heart. He began to kiss her hands and flinched when she pulled one from his palms. But Anne silently stroked his head and quietly replied, What I silently stroked his head and quietly replied, What are you, silly? How can I leave you now? After all, I also seem to love you. At that moment, Anne no longer doubted her feelings and understood that she was in love and did not want to part with Alex. Now she also realized that she was madly grateful to him, seemingly a stranger once, for his care and rescue. When Maria decided to check on her neighbors, or rather to see Max, and went in, she knocked on the door. Everyone was already at the table. Right in front of the entrance sat a man and a woman, in whom she immediately recognized her mother. The girl whispered, Mommy, it's you. You're the one who got burned in the fire. As the woman, not immediately recognizing the disfigured visitor, rushed toward her a moment later, dropping her chair, they stood embraced, crying, groping each other, as if they couldn't believe they were both alive. Everyone watched the scene in silence and understood nothing of what was going on. Then, sitting around the old men's table, there were many stories and confessions. Anne decided not to part again and went to spend the night at her daughter's house. There she cried and told how when she saw a woman in the burning house, she thought it was her mother and rushed to the rescue. With anger, she went on to talk about the treacherous stepfather who had cunningly appropriated the entire inheritance and had put her in the middle of nowhere. Mother and Alex, in spite of the neighbors' persuasion, stayed at Maria's. They went to the old folks' house almost every day, and while Anne and Alex did their chores, Maria continued to practice with the girl. Max began to visit the village every chance he got, and each time he brought a bouquet of beautiful flowers to Maria. The first time it happened, the girl embarrassedly said, "Why you? You shouldn't have." To which he smiled and replied, "Why can't I give a bouquet to a girl I like? Why can't I give a bouquet to a girl I like?" He was doing it for propriety, as a thank you for his lessons with his daughter. But one day, after he left, her mother sat down with her in the evening and whispered conspiratorially, "And our banker seems to have fallen in love with you." The girl seemed to cut her mother off as if frightened. "You what? But who will love me like this now? He is so handsome, smart, rich." Anne hugged and kissed her daughter. She said, "You are mine. You can love a person not for the reflection in the mirror, but for the reflection in the mirror, but for the soul. Your soul is amazing, and I see that you do care about him." Maria smiled enigmatically. Let's close the subject. She did notice how Max began to show her signs of attention in every way, but was very afraid of scaring away such unexpected happiness. Soon, when he came once again to visit her parents, he invited the neighbors to visit, promising a delicious shashlik and a surprise for everyone. Indeed, he always made shashlik himself, saying that he had been saving the recipe since his student days. When the treat was eaten, my parents were already chatting about their own topics, and Maria was creating new gymnastic sketches. Max came out of the house with a huge bouquet and shouted, "My dears, everyone, please gather around the table. I have an important message. Maria's heart froze treacherously. She felt that something very important was about to happen. Max, coming up to her in a trembling voice, began to say, "Oh, Maria, dear, I thought I would never again meet someone close to me in thought, spirit, and interest. 5 years ago, when my wife and Mother Angela died, I gave up on my personal life and decided to devote myself to my parents and daughter. But when I met you, I realized that when you are near me, I am happy. I am grateful to fate that you ended up in this wilderness. Otherwise, we might not have met. I ask you to always be there for me. Marry me." He pulled a box from the heart of the bouquet and held out the ring as he opened it. Maria could not believe what was happening. Tears of joy were in everyone's eyes at that moment. Everyone was waiting for an answer from her. Maria said in a quiet voice, "I agree." Angela, doing a couple of joyful pas with her feet, shouted, "Why, hooray! You're going to be my mother now!" "Daddy, aren't we going to take her to our house to live now?" His dad, smiling, hugged both of them and replied, "Course, where would we be without her?" Seeing how shy Maria was about her face, it was decided to postpone the wedding a bit and have plastic surgery as well. The girl was very scared, but her beloved was by her side and gave her confidence and strength almost every second. The surgery was successful without any complications, and Maria was quickly on the mend. When all stitches and bandages were removed, she was afraid to take a mirror in her hands, but the reflection she saw there made her cry. The result surpassed all expectations. She became even more beautiful. The prophecy of the unknown nurse had come true. When all was over, the lovers set a date for their wedding. Exciting preparations for the festivities began. There was plenty of time, and it was decided not to make pompous events and to spend this day in the close circle of friends and relatives. But all the same, it was necessary to prepare. One day, Max asked Maria and the future mother-in-law to stop at his bank to wait a little bit and then they all went together to choose a restaurant and a suit for Max. It was decided to buy the bride's dress without him. Anne said, "We're seeing the bride in a dress before the wedding is bad luck, and we believe in everything now." So it was decided. At the appointed time, two beautiful, elegantly dressed ladies entered the bank, and it was hard to recognize Anne and Maria in them anymore. They were waiting for the end of the meeting in the reception area of Max and were talking cheerfully to the secretary. She herself had recently got married and was enthusiastically telling about the celebration, showing the photos on her phone and trying to share her experience, however small, of family life. Max, as soon as he was free, offered, "Well, lovely ladies, first let's go to my favorite restaurant for lunch. I'm terribly hungry. Then we'll decide where to spend our most joyful day." He kissed Maria, and they headed toward out, while the young ones lagged a little behind, discussing something merrily, and went to the door and began to open it. What was her surprise when the massive door on the back was pushed open, and she was almost head on with her past. On the threshold stood Leo, and he, of course, was hard to recognize, just as he had trouble recognizing his ex-wife and stepdaughter in the well-groomed and beautiful women. Only, unlike them, it was hard to recognize this con man and this frightened little man. He had changed from a full, self-satisfied Alphonse to a hunted, bat-eyed animal. Maria, when she came closer and recognized him as Leo, cried out, "You rascal, you scoundrel, what are you doing here?" Immediately coming to her senses, she grabbed her fiancé's hand and quickly pleaded, "Max, call the police right away. This is the same crook con artist who set fire to our house and got his hands on my father's inheritance." Leo immediately regained consciousness and was about to flee, but the bank guards, hearing everything, had already twisted his arms. The whole time they were waiting for the police to arrive, he begged Anne to forgive him, never shutting up. "Well, forgive me, you fool, the devil has got me, but I have already paid enough. I wanted to get married, but I got such a swindler that she took every penny from me without waiting for my wedding. You know I can't get a job after I was wounded." But then, seeing the look of Maria, he was silent for a moment, but continued, "I had to live on something, so I borrowed from some bandits. Now they're threatening to kill me if I don't pay it back. Anne, I love you. Help me." Anne, sitting by the window, didn't even look back at him. At that moment, he and Maria wanted the same thing, to run away, to leave, not to hear. But Max, as if sensing this, barked at the complainant. "Shut up, or there will be no one to take to the police." Turning to Anne and Maria, calmly added, "Understand, it is necessary to wait for the arrival of the police, to tell them about everything so that this scoundrel will get what he deserves." Leo had already regretted 100 times that he had come to that bank for a loan, but there was nothing he could do about it. The law enforcement officers arrived and took the swindler away with them. A couple of months later, the trial took place, and Leo got what he deserved for both the murder and the arson. Max, as soon as he found out who this poor guy had borrowed money from, said, "They won't leave him alone. Even behind bars, they will either beat him up or kill him." At that moment, neither Anne nor Mary felt the slightest pity. They were ready to kill him themselves, but the wedding preparations quickly made them forget what had happened. A couple of weeks later, the marriage registration was scheduled, and everyone was looking forward to it. They chose the groom's once favorite restaurant, now a place where the three of them often liked to hang out and have what they called delicious evenings. All eyes were on the preparations for the day. Festive outfits were thought out for everyone. Bouquets for the guests. For the bride, invitations were sent out, and a host was chosen. When we chose a dress for Anne, my daughter was surprised that she chose a cream, almost white floor-length dress. She really liked the way it fit her mom's figure, but she joked, smiling, "Aren't you afraid the guests will confuse who the bride is at the wedding?" But Mom, with a sly squint, replied, "That's okay, don't worry." The day of the wedding came. Everyone entered the hall to beautiful music, and the registry clerk said solemnly, "I ask the couples who have decided to join together in marriage to come up to me, and the guests to sit on the chairs." Maria looked at Max in surprise, her eyes filled with either question or consternation. She didn't understand why couples. When she turned around in the hall and saw Alex and Anne approaching them, embarrassed, she understood everything at once and smiled. Alex, after the operation was done, was still limping a little, but he tried to walk with confidence. She whispered that they had decided to unite to celebrate their wedding anniversary together. At that moment, it seemed that there were no happier women on the planet than this mother and daughter. And so they were. Every anniversary they celebrated all together in the parents' country house with divine shashliks. And a year later there was a cute baby boy whom my older sister was happy to take care of.